What's up, guys? Paco here. I came across this video about Ukraine taking stuff back from Russia in just 1 week. I don't see a lot of people talking about the Russia-Ukraine war anymore, with everything going on in Iran and what happened in Venezuela recently. I figured we'll go ahead and we'll give it a watch. On your way in, make sure you like the video, subscribe to help support the channel, leave a comment down below.
A week is a long time in war. Anything can happen. And for Russia, 7 short days could transform what was promising to be a revived oil export economy into a flaming mess caused by Ukrainian deep strikes. Of course, that's precisely what has
Ukraine
happened.
has been
Russia
fucking their
has
shit
been forced
up.
to endure 7 days of hell that have snatched everything away. Ukraine did in 1 week what sanctions have failed to do for years, and all Russia can do is pick through the flaming wreckage. First, we take you to March 31st. That's when the news broke that Ukraine had carried out a deep strike against Russia's vital Baltic Sea port of Ust-Luga. The attack against a massive oil complex that is responsible for processing 700,000 barrels of oil exports every single day, in addition to other oil exports such as grains, fertilizers, and coal, was a shot against a Baltic Sea export network that handles 40% of Russia's oil sales. That alone would have been very bad news for Putin. But what we saw on March 31st wasn't a one-off. If anything, it was more like a victory lap, as it was the exclamation point on a week-long series of deep strikes that targeted Ust-Luga and Russia's other key Baltic port, Primorsk. In fact, the March 31st attack represented the 4th time in a single week that Ukraine's drones had come crashing down on Ust-Luga, and that sustained pressure sends a very clear message to Putin that the oil infrastructure he once thought was safe is now a target. Scratch that, it's not just a target, it's something that Ukraine can hit at will. The same goes for Primorsk, which has been justifiably victimized by repeated Ukrainian strikes during a week of hell for Russia that must have felt like it would have no end. United 24 Media provides the details, noting that Ukraine's campaign against Putin's Baltic Sea ports began on March 23rd, with a handful of what seemed to be isolated strikes.
Ukraine has been putting these drones to very effective use. Flying drones, sea drones, they've been giving it to Russia. They destroyed Russia's Black Sea fleet without even having a navy of their own.
Ukraine had unleashed its flying sanctions once more, seemingly as a response to Russia's ability to capitalize on the chaos in Iran right now. But that was surely all it was going to be, and if it had been, it would have been enough. The March 23rd attack caused multiple explosions at Primorsk, along with fires at fuel tanks that are key to the operation of a port that can store 921,000 tons of crude oil and 240,000 tons of petroleum products when it's operating at its peak. But what seemed like an isolated attack proved to be anything but. Ukraine followed up. Day after day, drones have rained down on Ust-Luga and Primorsk in a terrific campaign that is far larger and stronger than anything that Putin could have anticipated. These ports were supposed to be safe. That's why Russia was using them. But Ukraine's drones have been traveling hundreds of miles, evading air defenses or simply not encountering them at all, to cause 7 days of sorrow for the sadistic leader who ordered the invasion of Ukraine's territory.
Sorry to pause again, guys, but I just thought of this. Do y'all remember, I think it was 2024, when Ukraine loaded a crap ton of drones into trailers on semi-trucks and used those to attack Russian airfields?
After that week from hell, Russia has to face up to a fact. Everything is burning in Ust-Luga and Primorsk, and the results speak for themselves. 3 fuel storage tankers at Ust-Luga were destroyed in a March 29th attack. Those tanks had a combined capacity of 90,000 tons of oil, all of which is burning, along with the ruined shells of tanks that once contained it. Ukraine's March 25th strike against the same port took out 5 fuel storage tanks, which is another 150,000 tons of fuel up in flames, along with hitting a trio of Shadow Fleet tankers docked at the port. Similar damage has been seen at Primorsk, and Russia has been forced to completely halt all oil loading several times over the past week as it puts out fires, assesses damage, and deals with the fact that weeks, if not months of maintenance are going to be needed to get its destroyed ports back to anywhere near the capacity they once had. And even if that repair work starts, Russia knows that Ukraine can just target the ports again. Nothing could stop them during the 7 days of hell. It's not likely that Russia will be able to do anything about future strikes either. The sailing of the Shadow Fleet tankers, or should we say the lack thereof, is also revealing. During the week between March 23rd and 31st, only 4 tankers were loaded at Primorsk. The usual number is 10. Ukraine cut down tanker loading volume by 60%, At Ust-Luga, it was even higher, as only 2 of a typical 8 have been loaded for an 80% decline. And of course, fewer loaded tankers leads to less oil sold. From a typical figure of 4.1 million barrels exported every day, Russia's oil sales have tumbled to just 2.3 million barrels. That's 1.8 million barrels that aren't being sold every day at a time when Russia is trying to make hay while the sun shines, due to oil prices rocketing up in the wake of Operation Epic Fury. Of course, fewer barrels being sold also means less revenue generated by Russia's oil industry. A March 31st United 24 media report has the details. It says that the average price of Russia's Urals crude had risen by $11.30, hitting a high of $73.24 per barrel as a result of the war in Iran. But despite this sharp increase, the week of hell that Ukraine inflicted on Russia with its flying sanctions led to Russia only generating $1.44 billion for the week ending March 29th. The previous week had seen Russia's oil giants earn revenue of $2.45 billion, so that's over $1 billion of oil revenue that the Kremlin can't tax for the war. That's the entire point. Russia thought it had been thrown an economic lifeline in the war, as a combination of Western sanction failures and rapidly rising oil prices would allow it to generate billions of dollars more in oil revenue. And then something changed. Ukraine took aim with its drones and hit targets over and over again. Now, the hay that Russia wanted to make while the sun shone has ignited under the firepower that Ukraine has delivered to the Baltic ports. In just 7 days, Ukraine has managed to do what sanctions have failed to do for years, and it's placed a Russian economy that, for a moment, had a brief glimmer of hope on the fast track to complete ruination. We'll be coming back to Russia's economic issues later. First, let's home in on the sanctions failures, to which it could be argued that Ukraine's week of whittling away at Russia's energy exports is a direct response to.
Yeah, the sanctions that were placed on by the Western cultures had absolutely no effect. China ended up buying most of the oil and helping Russia's economy. Iran bought oil, helped out their economy. Plus, I think North Korea did also, and they all sent weapons. I know North Korea sent soldiers, Iran sent drones, and I forget what China sent. I think they just sent technology pieces over to help them build stuff.
It would be unfair to claim that Western sanctions are a complete and total failure against the Russian war machine. They have indeed taken a bit out of Putin's ability to wage war, as the Economics Observatory points out. Between the start of Putin's invasion and August 2025, the outlet says, Western sanctions have cost Russia about $100 billion in revenue that can no longer be used to pay soldiers or build equipment for use in Ukraine. That's a good result, there's no denying that. However, the problem lies in the fact that $100 billion for a little over 3 years pales in comparison to the amount of money that Russia has still been able to generate from the sales of oil and gas. In 2024 alone, the observatory points out, Russia was able to generate $235 billion from its oil and gas exports. This was despite sanctions, and it was actually 0.5% more than the amount generated in 2023.
Damn.
Only 3.7% less than the revenue generated in 2021, which was the year after the COVID-19 pandemic crippled oil sales. These aren't the kinds of sweeping results that Ukraine needed to see from sanctions, and they've had the consequence of affording Putin far more money than he should have to fund his invasion of Ukraine. Throw the Shadow Fleet into the mix, which Putin is believed to have spent well over $14 billion building, and is responsible for even more illicit oil and gas money flowing into Russia, and you get a problem. The West's sanctions are good on paper. They're also having an effect, but they don't go far enough, and it could be argued that the enforcement of those sanctions hasn't lived up to the promise of what they're supposed to deliver. Then Operation Epic Fury and Operation Roaring Lion were launched. That joint operation against Iran, as effective as it has been as a display of pure American firepower, has added to the sanctions issue by throwing Russia a lifeline, albeit one that isn't as strong as Putin wants it to be.
Yeah, Russia is trying to take advantage of us being in a conflict in Iran. Though we have totally destroyed the Iranian military, it's still the fact that Iran refuses to negotiate. And with that, it's because they believe that Russia has their back. But I think my honest opinion in the matter is that once Iran capitulates, Russia will be more likely to come to the table to negotiate about Ukraine.
But while we're on this, if this is the kind of insight that you want to see, remember to subscribe to The Military Show. We break it down like this every single week. There are plenty of arguments for and against the continuation of Operation Epic Fury. But the one thing that everybody can agree on is that it's caused chaos in energy markets. Iran's decision to blockade the Strait of Hormuz through the use of asymmetric tactics has directly influenced the rising oil prices we mentioned.
Yep.
And for the first few weeks of the conflict, Putin and his cronies were all smiles as the oil money started rolling in. In a March 12th report, The Guardian noted that Russia had managed to take in about 6 billion euros, or $6.93 billion, from fossil fuel sales during the first 2 weeks or so of the war in Iran. That represented a 14% surge over the same period in February, amounting to an extra 672 million euros, or about $776 million in oil, gas, and coal sales. That's all extra money that Russia wasn't supposed to make and that the Kremlin can tax to fund Putin's invasion. By the end of March, Business Insider was reporting that Russia's oil was selling at above global prices due to the supply shock caused by the Iran war. Russia's oil had gone from being traded at a $12 discount to selling for a $4 premium compared to North Sea dated oil, which is the exact opposite effect that sanctions and price caps are supposed to have. Speaking of sanctions, Putin has enjoyed another boon since the beginning of the Iran war. Toward the end of March, the US eased some of the sanctions that it had implemented against Russia. This isn't a blanket lifting of sanctions, and it's important to note that it's only temporary. But what it means is that certain Russian vessels that were once on America's sanction list, which includes oil container ships sailing under the Russian flag, have been given a general license to complete their oil unloading operations. The reprieve is only for cargo that was loaded before March 12th, RBC Ukraine reports, and it is valid until April 11th. But even with these restrictions, America's decision has been met with mixed feelings. On one hand, it's easy to see why the US made this choice, as it likely sees the temporary lifting of sanctions as a quick and easy, though by no means long-term, fix for the oil price shock caused by Operation Epic Fury. However, several Western leaders, including German Chancellor Friedrich Merz and French President Emmanuel Macron, have labeled the measure as unnecessary and, in Macron's case, in no way justified. Even a temporary reprieve for Russia could open the door for more sanctions relief in the future, especially if Operation Epic Fury evolves into a long-term campaign. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky joined the condemnation, stating during a meeting with Macron in France, "Lifting the sanctions will lead to a strengthening of Russia's position. This easing alone by the United States could provide Russia with about $10 billion for the war. That certainly does not help peace." Now, of course, everything that the US has done that helps Russia is temporary. The same could be said of the Strait of Hormuz blockade and the oil price chaos that it has helped to cause. US President Donald Trump himself stated on April 1st that the US is finishing the job in Iran, though it will take another 2 to 3 weeks to do so. We'll have to wait and see if that's true. If it is, then an end date to the chaos that has benefited Russia is in sight. But for Ukraine, any benefit at all to Russia is too much. Rather than letting Putin get away with generating more cash, both through poor implementation of past sanctions and everything that has happened during Operation Epic Fury, Ukraine took the second option. If traditional sanctions aren't helping as much as they should, then a week's worth of flying sanctions will do the job. And that brings us back to Ust-Luga, Primorsk.
Ukraine and Volodymyr Zelensky did the correct thing with sanctions being eased and not doing what they should do. Putin escalating his war in Ukraine. Zelensky did the right thing. He took to the skies and to the oceans, and he helped protect his people. I stand behind Zelensky for making this decision.
And Russia's entire Baltic Sea oil lifeline in general. Plus, there's one more thing that we've yet to cover, so stick with us until the end to find out what it is. Now, on the Baltic front, we've already shared plenty of numbers covering the immediate impact of the 7 days of hell. Let's now look at what Ukraine has achieved through a wider lens. According to the Atlantic Council, the 2 Baltic ports that Ukraine has been shattering for 7 days are responsible for 40% of all Russia's export capacity. That is an enormous number, and Ukraine's strikes against that capacity are causing plenty of concern in and outside of Russia. Oil and gas industry analyst Boris Aronstein has already labeled what we've just seen this week as the most serious threat to exports of Russian oil since Putin launched his invasion back in 2022. That threat can be built on. Ukraine has clearly established pathways to the Baltic ports, and Russia has now had more than a week to respond to them but hasn't. These strikes are also evidence, were any more of it needed, that Ukraine has built up its long-range strike capabilities to the point where it can hit a huge number of targets that are of critical importance to Russia.
Only took 3 years for him to build it up.
To which Putin has to pay attention, because Ukraine repeatedly hitting Russia's Baltic ports is going to take them offline, perhaps for the duration of the Ukraine war, assuming Ukraine continues deploying its flying sanctions. Let's revisit the early oil sales success that Russia enjoyed during the first 2 weeks of Operation Epic Fury. We told you earlier that The Guardian reported that Russia made $6.93 billion during the first 2 weeks of the war. The Baltic ports haven't been shut down completely by Ukraine, but they're edging closer. If that happens, the $6.93 billion for 2 weeks drops to $4.158 billion, just by virtue of Russia losing 40% of its export capacity. Let's throw in the $235 billion figure we mentioned earlier, which was Russia's 2024 oil and gas revenue. That drops to $141 billion when 40% of Russia's export capacity is taken out of commission. The point we're making here is that Ukraine's flying sanctions have shown that the Russian economy can be impacted heavily in as little as 1 week. Imagine what Ukraine could achieve with a month of strikes or a year. The Baltic ports could be transformed into a hot zone that no tanker captain in their right mind would want to enter, and that could pull billions upon billions of dollars out of Putin's war purse. And it gets better for Ukraine. A moment ago, we told you that there is another thing that we've yet to cover in the video. That other thing is Siberia. If Putin thinks that what's happening in Russia's Baltic ports is a problem right now, he'll be furious when he figures out that Ukraine has been connecting the dots to create a campaign designed to cripple Russia's economy. United 24 Media has the details, as it points out that Ust-Luga and Primorsk are part of a Siberian oil supply chain that includes the Druzhba pipeline and a pair of refineries, Kirishnev-Org-Syntez and Yaroslavl. Collectively, these facilities are responsible for 2.6 million of the 9 million barrels that Russia itself claims that it can produce every single day. That's almost a third of all Russia's oil exports focused on these 5 sites. Now, Ust-Luga and Primorsk are being hit so hard that they're forced to shut down. The Druzhba pipeline has been shut down since January, which is causing supply problems for Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic, and several other European countries. That's 3 of 5 dots connected. Another comes into play when you realize that the week of hell Ukraine inflicted on Russia also included a strike against the Kirishnev-Org-Syntez refinery about midway through the week. That strike was powerful enough to close the refinery down, which takes yet more barrels that Russia could export out of the picture. As for Yaroslavl, you can probably guess what we're about to tell you. It was also hit. March 28th brought with it the news that this refinery was also in flames following a Ukrainian drone strike. Dot upon dot has been connected. While Ust-Luga and Primorsk have been grabbing all of the headlines, and rightfully so, the specter behind those obvious problems for Russia is that Ukraine has been taking out the entire Siberian oil supply chain. Bit by bit, it has crumbled. This was coordinated and calculated to an extent that we haven't seen from Ukraine at any point during the war. The days of isolated strikes against Russia's oil facilities are over. Ukraine has upgraded its strategy again. Repeated strikes against key nodes in entire supply chains are now the order of the deep strike day, and that's the big problem for Putin. He's losing critical assets that prop up Russia's economy at a time when that economy is stagnating, and even pro-Kremlin experts are saying that it's being brought to its knees. The Central Bank of Russia, the Higher School of Economics, and the Center for Macroeconomic Analysis and Short-Term Forecasting are all putting out indicators that the Russian economy has been entering a recession since November 2025. And it's only going to go downhill from here. Ukraine has Russia on the ropes. The challenge now is to keep it there. The week from hell should be the combination of jabs that is followed by haymakers, uppercuts, and everything else that Ukraine can throw at Russia. In other words, Ukraine's task is now to keep the Siberian supply chain offline. Temporary closures are one thing, and they showcase the effectiveness of Ukraine's flying sanctions. But if Ukraine keeps it up, Operation Epic Fury will end. Russia's infrastructure won't be able to recover, and the billions that Russia is already losing to Ukraine's strikes will become tens of billions that could be enough to pressure Putin into ending his invasion. And as Russia is trying to lick wounds that Ukraine seems intent on reopening following the week of hell, Ukraine is going from strength to strength. Deals are being signed in the Middle East that could secure Ukraine's financial and warfighting future for a long time to come, and it's all happening because of the lessons that Ukraine has learned in its battle against Russia. Do you want to find out more? Check out our video.
Ukraine is putting up a hell of a fight, even though they're, what was it, like 1/10 the size of Russia or something like that. Everybody back in 2021, 2022 thought that Ukraine will just be steamrolled by Russia. Ukraine has a real chance to come back and win this if they play their cards right. I agree with what he said. If they could follow up and keep the Siberian pipeline, keep that offline permanently, or at least for the time being, Russia's going to collapse. Their economy is going to go down, and it's going to be one hell of a mess. The Russian Federation is going to collapse. Putin's going to either be executed or exiled, and Maybe this time around we could actually get a Russia and a Russian president who is more willing to work with the rest of the world and establish some sort of peace. If you guys enjoyed the video, remember to leave a like, comment down below, subscribe to help support the channel, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.